Right. Well, what I'm going to do is talk about some things that I've found difficult to find. A lot of them have been in our collection, or some of them still are. We are offloading a bit of Shelley now, but and I'll talk to them fairly briefly, but they range across earthenware and china. I'd like to acknowledge pattern books, and particularly Chris Davenport for all the work he did, and Jerry Pierce for the work he did on registration pictures and information. I'd like to start with some china and just a bit of background. 1860, Henry Wileman by then owned the Foley China Works, Foley Potteries, and added a China Works, but we don't know anything about it. Never seen a piece. In 1872, Henry's son James owned the China Works, and he owned the earthenware works, and he brought in Joseph Shelley to run the China Works. 1880 was the Wileman and Company's first registered China pattern. 1882 is when the oldest surviving pattern books start. 1883, first known use for a Wileman and Company logo. 1884, James Wileman retired from Wileman and Company, leaving the China side of the business entirely to be owned by Shelley. And in 1892, he shut his earthenware works. In 1894, Wileman and Company added an earthenware works. And in 1910, because they couldn't get exclusive use of the Foley, they added the Shelley backstand. Well, what better place to start than the very first registered pattern? I don't know that this is all that rare, but it's rare with Shelley and Wileman collectors, and that seems to be because it was poorly marked and had a registration number only. And I've had people tell me, oh, I've seen that pattern, but I didn't realise it was Wileman and Company. So have a good look at it, because there could be some around. That's the registration picture, and you'll see there are 20 little pictures in circular surrounds, rondelles. And 40 years later, about half a dozen of those got a rerun when they added them to the Cloisello background and brought in a couple of new pattern numbers. Some of them, if they have gold on them, they used 8223. I'd point out that the cup that I showed you in that picture of the very first registered pattern is a little different. It has an extra bar where the handle joins the cup, but within a couple of years that seemed to have disappeared. The second registered pattern, and again, here's the registration submission. You'll see it. It covered a bird on branches with some blossom and some twigs. And here is a small bowl, which is an example of it. Now, a little later, there are entries in the pattern book for bird and japonica, and for registered japonica and bird, but only one of those patterns out of, I think, 16 of them had mentioned the registration bit. So I think that's fairly definitely it, and examples of this particular piece. Now, I think you could presume that the japonica blossom could be represented there, but our japonica doesn't have such sharp foliage. Anyway, they've done away with the foliage and added more blossom. And here's an example of both. The teapot on the left is the earliest datable teapot, and you can see that the later patterns, there are variations in colour, ways, and so on. And the teapot, it's worth a mention because it is the oldest datable Wileman and Company teapot, and it is quite large for a piece of china at that time. Again, only marked with a registration number. So you need to know the registration number, or you need to recognise the pattern. The third registered pattern, and I'm not going through all the registered patterns, the third one, there is one entry in the earliest pattern books for registered apple blossom, and it again was marked only with a registration number, and there don't seem to be too many pieces of this in Shelley collections. And the centre of that registered pattern, there's the registration submission, the centre of it was a sunflower, which seemed a bit out of sort of kilter with the blossoms. But anyway, they used that on its own on a cup number 3411. I've thrown this in because it's a Victoria Cup and it's only identified by a pattern number. And if you look at the pattern book, it says same as 1922. So presumably the pattern they're using is from an earlier pattern book predating the pattern books we know about. Only the cup is marked. You'll notice down the bottom of the pattern book entry, it says mint and saucer. Well, the mint and saucer was deeper than the usual Victorian saucer, and this one is deeper. So I think we can be reasonably sure that it is a Wileman and Company Victoria trio, but with a mint and saucer. I've thrown this in. Micklewright aren't rare, but they're not that common. And a set of 12 intact plates are fairly uncommon. So there's a nice acid-etched border. Pictures are all marked by Micklewright, who did the centre paintings, and he's also painted a name on the back. And very quickly, here are the pictures. Blackcock, curlew, mallard, partridge, pheasant, plover, and prairie chick is an American game bird. There are apparently two groups, a greater and a lesser, in geographically separate positions. But this may have been made, this set of plates, to appeal to the American market because we acquired it some years ago from America. Ptarmigan, snipe, teal, woodcock, and a wood pigeon with a nest and a couple of eggs. The next one I'd like to talk about are some gems which are decorated by Japanese people. There are 6 in the series, as shown in the Views and Crests book, and I have only ever been able to find pictures of 5 of them. And so the fifth one is shown by the illustration in the pattern book. And these pieces generally had a picture on each side, as you can see from the taller of the two there, the back and front. Motoring scenes, another one that seems to be hard to find. The 3 of them are shown here on china. Now, the pattern was entered originally for earthenware, and then they gave it a china number the same as the earthenware. But in 1902, 7372, the pattern number, was entered in a china book for a cup pattern. And in 1906, they crossed this out, as you can see right up the top there, and just had motor cars. But I have never seen an example on earthenware. And the picture in the pattern book of the 4th shows a car being pulled by a team of horses, but it's been rather damaged, and it's such a poor picture I didn't think it was worth putting in. Another large china piece for the time, and this is one of the angelic series, which decorated wares with ladies' heads. And this is quite a big 9.5-inch diameter bowl in colour. Now, most of the angelic you see tends to be whiteware. And this one has a registration number. And again, that's a little strange because the registration number isn't for angelic. It was taken out for shell about 15 or so years before. And why it ended up on the back stamps used on angelic, I don't know. My guess would be that they used an old pattern sheet to print off the, by transfer printing, print off the logo that goes on the back, and this registration number was on it because the pattern plate was originally used for shell. But anyway, I can't explain that registration number. And here's a few more examples. Most of the angelic ware you see is just undecorated whiteware, but there is a hair tidy which was made for a firm in Rothesay, and on one side has the Rothesay badge, on the other has some Scotch thistle, and it seems to be uncommon. China miniatures decorated as gems uh, are also hard to find. There are two patent book entries in 1909, and then later on they were entered with 6 entries. The original 2 entries only accommodated a blue background as a surround, and they expanded that out to a blue, a pink, and a green. And so the new entries accommodated the 3 colours. And the first one says 8 as 8177, the second one as 8178. But again, there are pictures in the patent book of a couple of landscapes. But here are 2 examples of the actual thing. 8178 on the bottom left looks quite different, and 10384, the later entry, which is supposed to be as 8178, looks different again. So probably they just let the decorators paint something that suited them. Few early coffee cups seem hard to get. All of these cups shown here, and I'll talk about a couple of them. Victoria probably needs an explanation because up until now, I've had it in our club's pocketbook of cup shapes as Worcester Body Victoria Handle. But when I looked at it, again, in fact, for this talk, I decided that it's a Victoria coffee. It's got an identical handle, and the only 2 examples I know of have patterns that were both entered for Victoria. So I think it's reasonable to assume it's a Victoria coffee, but if people would like to express another opinion after this talk, I'll be interested to hear it. There's an unidentified coffee, the one in the middle, which has a snowdrop handle, but the actual number of indentations or scallops or whatever you like to call them match Daisy. So I don't know whether they brought this in. There's only a few around, but whether it was supposed to be a coffee cup for Daisy or a coffee cup for Snowdrop, or whether they were having something each way and that they were looking to make one coffee cup that would serve both shapes because they do have the same sources. I don't know whether anyone's got any more examples which might throw a bit more light on that. Stanley's another one that's fairly rare. Only one patent book entry where it was called Low Coffee, and then someone underneath has written Stanley Shape. So perhaps first entry, they hadn't decided on a name, but it doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. It was made in 6 colours, 1 pattern. Bamboo seems another one that's hard to find, only 1 patent entry, and that was in 1891. But the first Wileman, one of the sons of the first proprietor of Wileman and Company, took some examples, I presume, to the exposition in Chicago in 1893. So it must have had a slightly longer life than that. Poppy. Now, that was one that was only fairly recently identified. We knew of some entries for poppy in the patent books, but no one had tied a shape to it. And we did write some articles, but what identified it was a picture in the patent book for a pattern that was on an example that we had. And the backlit saucer shows up that pattern rather better than just trying to take the surface pattern. Roman tea was another one that was only named fairly recently. Most of the patterns listed for that seem to be badges, and I haven't seen any examples of badges, but they're not very big with collectors, but this pattern identified it. There's a very narrow Wileman and Company coffee. Now, the usual Wileman and Company coffee shown in the middle of that picture is rather wider where the foot comes off the base, but this one is quite a narrow cup. I only know of one example, and it was made for a company in America, which I'm going to give a brief mention here to Milton cup dates because I originally got some dates from Hill when I was compiling the Cup Shapes book. And she has a number of entries for patterns which she claimed were used on both Gainsborough and Milton, starting in 1910. And that was the date I originally showed for Milton. But when I looked at the pattern books, only Gainsborough is named, and Gainsborough first pattern or first mentions of it aren't till 1923. So I think a better date should be 1923 into the 1920s. And Milton's shown on the right, but I think Hill must have got confused with the wider base, where the base comes off the cup, and Milton. Devonshire is another one that's a bit hard to find, and it's only 6 pattern book entries. And this cup on the right, I only know of one, and it's a Devonshire body, but with a royal handle. Now, I don't know whether that was someone put the wrong handles on and they sold them anyway, or whether it was a factory trial that they decided they didn't like much. If anyone else has some examples, I'd love to hear about them. It might throw a bit more light on what that cup shape was. Now, I've thrown in a couple more here. This picture we know about because it was registered. They bothered to register it. It's Queen Anne shape, but with dainty style surface markings. And there are some jugs, but as far as I know, no one's ever found a teapot, a plate, or a cup and saucer. If they have, again, I'd love to know about it. Hyderabad was one that was entered in the pattern books in 1939 in a specials pattern book, which shows the badges and so on. And it was part of a dinner set. And we know that there's a tall pot, which might have been for coffee or might have been for tea. They must have made a few spares which escaped because we have that white one on the left. We've arbitrarily called the cup size as tea and coffee and wide, but whether that's how they were used, the wide one seems so wide it could almost have been used for soup or something like that. And now I'd like to move to some earthenware. Now, originally, Wileman Company only had a stamp for China, the one shown on the far left. And when they built their earthenware factory, they obviously decided they needed some new back stamps, and they produced these 3 on the right. The Foley China, the Foley Faience, and I think they were going to call nearly all their earthenware Faience, and semi-porcelain, which was used for high-fired earthenware to the semi-vitreous stage, and it was used for wares that needed to be heated up, or sterilised or used in cooking and things like that. When Frederick Reed came along, he introduced some new styles and gave them names according to how they were decorated. And that's when Abato, Intarsio and Spano Lustra came in. Now, the Foley, the Faience got a new back stamp, and it's shown on the right, but the old one continued in use, presumably because it was engraved in some pattern sheets and so on. And so both the Foley Faience ones ran in parallel for some years. Now, Reed would appear to have introduced a numbering system. The Faience range seems to embrace an awful lot of styles, and as I said, seems to have been a bit of catch-all for all their earthenware. And you can find it with no shape numbers only, and then various thousands of series. And a few examples are shown below of a Faience without any sort of number, just the shape number, and the Barto one, a Faience one, an Intarsio one, and a Spano Lustra one. And the Spano Lustra one has the same pattern as the Intarsio, but in a different colorway. And anyway, there are the numbers. You've heard about them before. Intarsio were 3,000, but they ran out of those numbers, and they ran into a few problems when they wanted to put 2 patterns on the same shape. So they went to 7,000s. Cloicellos sometimes had a 5,000 number, but often just and We'll see a bit more about that in Spanolustra. Well, let's look at the first series of Barto. These were where they applied layers of coloured slip over the top of the earthenware body, sometimes several layers, and then they carved them back to show the colours, and then they would appear to have added a little bit of extra colour, like the dark blue on the pot on the left. And here's a few more examples, but they do seem to be fairly thin on the ground. The one in the middle obviously had a layer of blue slip applied and then a layer of green slip, and the green was carved through to show the blue. The 2000 series seems to be very rare. I only know of two examples. The one on the right's in our collection. The one on the left is Jerry's collection. The one on the right we got in England. The one on the left Jerry got in Australia, if I remember correctly. Cloisello. Now, they seem to have liked the name Cloisello. For a while, they were outlining intarsio patterns in gold, and they were stamping out the intarsio name, putting Cloisello on it, and overpainting the number so that 3054 became 5054. That seems to have had a fairly brief run, because there are other examples, which I suspect might be later, where they changed the name but not the number, and then eventually they seem to have decided not even to change the name. And there are more examples with just the intarsio name and number but gold outlined, and I presume they would have been more expensive than the normal intarsio. A tile. Now, I only know of one other tile in this style. This is an imperial toilet jug, and on the right is a dainty tile, or a dainty toilet jug, which did belong to the Shelley family. I don't know where it is now. But the one on the left is labelled faience, and it was, if you look at the pattern number, this is the pattern book entry, it just says new, and then later on it says new toilet and things like that. And then eventually they settled on the name Imperial. It has a registration number, which you might have seen on the back stamp in the previous picture, and that's for the jug, the four-sided jug in the middle. So I don't know whether they put that on just to infer that it was registered, but it doesn't appear on imperial toilet jugs. Now, there are two 8000 sets of numbers. The very first one they used for Old Chelsea, and as far as I can see, there was something like about 20 or 30 book patterns entered in a book that's now been lost. And they later reused the 8000 numbers. So if you look up Old Chelsea pattern numbers in a pattern book, you'll find that they don't refer to Old Chelsea at all. They refer to other things, toilet jugs and a few things like that. You can see there that they had a blue background for some of it with a lot of little gold rings, and they two types of flowers in yellow and red. The red ones had an R after them. Later, not that much later, but 1907, they introduced a style that was somewhat like Old Chelsea. They only had one pattern, and they used some Irish flowers, which are like the ones in the Old Chelsea, but they did away with all the little gold rings on a blue background and just gilded them. And there's a couple of examples. And they were called Tristo wares, although that doesn't appear on the shapes anywhere. A couple of faience clock cases. Now, these would appear to have been made to sell more cheaply than the intarsio clock cases. A rooster on the left, sunflower on the right. They both had pattern numbers, and when you look up the pattern numbers, they're for toilet wares, so I don't know where those pattern numbers came from. Now, Cloisello, as I said, they must have liked the name because it got a rerun in about 1910 for some wares which show these peony flowers and branches. And there were three colourways of that with that foliage, but it was used only fairly briefly with a Cloisello stamp on the base, And then I've thrown this one in because this is in the pattern books and it's labelled Cloicello on black. But what resemblance it has to the previous one, I don't know. So why it was called Cloicello, I don't know. But anyway, I have never seen an example. If someone has one, I would love to see it, a picture of it. And the Cloicello, although they dropped the Cloicello name, they did continue with the pattern. And there are some pattern entries for the same foliage, but without the Cloicello name, entered a little later as 8,000 patterns. And there's the three Cloicellos. You're probably all familiar with the white daisy on blue spirals background, which they used from 1913 to 20, which was stamped Cloicello. But the first one, the gold outlined intarsia, and the second one, and the third. Hawking scenes. Now, I've been calling these falconry, but I noticed when I looked at the pattern book that said Tudor-style early English hawking. Two pictures, and they seem to be quite uncommon. The plate on the right was in our collection. It shows a gentleman on his horse with a retainer and some foxhounds in the background, and another man walking along with a frame with some hawks sitting on it. And then the second one shows the actual hawk chasing what I presume must be a magpie or something like that. And that is known on a jug, which I photographed, as I recall, at the Barters. It uses the retainer from the first scene, but the horse and hawk and the bird from the right one. Orange lusted blue dragon. Now, blue dragon is not that rare, but I've only ever come across one example of orange lusted blue dragon, which is a little surprising because they blue lusted quite a few, orange lusted rather, quite a few blue patterns, but this is a jug. Sorry, I'll try again. This is a large vase, about 1919. And this one is a tube-lined dragon bowl. From the back stamp, it must be about the 1920s when they were doing a lot of dragon, or not a lot, but some dragons on lusterware. It's quite a large bowl. And the pattern is tube-lined. It's not lustered, but it has quite a glossy finish. The blue looks like it's been applied with a sponge, the background, but there's a close-up of the actual head. You can see the tube lining a little better there. Now, that's about as much as I thought you could stand, because I'm aware from my lecturing career that the numbness of the mind is directly related to the numbness of the behind. And so I'm going to bow out.